Hey guys, tonight we begin with the tragic brilliance of medieval human innovation, which usually happened about 5 minutes after someone died, a way that made everyone say, well, that was avoidable. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval moat, that glorious muddy ring of death surrounding castles across Europe. It looked intimidating, it sounded strategic, and it killed far more friends than enemies. In theory, the moat's purpose was to stop invaders. In practice, it stopped servants, cooks, and intoxicated knights who couldn't tell left from oops. Chronicles, or at least castle gossip with a quill, record a tragic number of accidental entries. That was the polite term for Geoffrey fell in again. Servants fetching water at night, children chasing ducks, and knights stumbling home from banquets in full armour, all met the same wet, undignified fate. You haven't truly lived until you've seen a man in 60 pounds of steel try to dog paddle. Swimming wasn't exactly common in the Middle Ages. If you could afford to bathe once a month, you were already suspicious. So when someone fell into the moat, the odds of survival were roughly equal to winning a jousting tournament blindfolded. The rescue method usually involved shouting, pointing, and eventually lighting another candle for the dearly departed. Over time, castle architects realized they might be killing more of their own people than invading armies. Thus began the first wave of safety features. Ropes were strung across bridges, railings were installed, and some castles even stationed guards near the water. Although, statistically, the guards were the next ones in. And the water itself? Not the sparkling blue ditch you see in fantasy paintings. Medieval moats were dumping grounds for sewage, dead animals, and whatever the kitchen staff didn't want to carry uphill. Falling in wasn't just fatal. It was a one-way ticket to becoming part of the plumbing. Yet the moat stayed. It looked impressive, sounded defensive, and smelled like bad decisions. Lords bragged about their deep, deadly moats the way modern homeowners brag about pools, conveniently ignoring the drownings. So yes, the moat was technically a safety feature, just not for the people who built it. It kept enemies out, friends in, and the castle's mortician permanently employed. In the early Middle Ages, helmets were optional, like seatbelts or common sense. The logic went something like this. If God wants me alive, he'll stop the sword. Spoiler, he didn't. Battlefields were essentially giant Darwin experiments. Knights galloped into combat with uncovered heads, swinging swords, and praying for divine aim. It worked great until someone's skull met a mace, and suddenly, theology became neurology. That's when someone, likely while scraping Geoffrey off the battlefield, finally said, maybe we should put a lid on this. The first helmets were basic. Metal bowls hammered into shape by blacksmiths who had zero medical training but plenty of enthusiasm. These early brain buckets offered minimal protection and maximum claustrophobia. Breathing was a luxury, and the field of vision was roughly equivalent to wearing a mailbox. Still, they caught on, because nothing sells innovation like trauma. Over time, helmets got fancy. Visors, crests, nose guards, everything except comfort. Crusaders wore them in desert heat, which was brave considering the inside temperature often reached slow roast. Many knights fainted mid-battle, face first into the dirt, while their enemies politely waited for them to regain consciousness so they could resume dying. Then came the Great Helm, a fully enclosed tin can for your head. It stopped arrows, but also air. Knights described the experience as inspirational, usually right before passing out. The sound inside was deafening, your own breathing, your own heartbeat, and the faint echo of your squire saying, "He's turning purple." Eventually, padding was added inside the helmet, not for comfort, but to reduce the hollow clang sound every time someone got hit. Medieval surround sound. Some even added small holes for airflow, which worked great until a crossbow bolt found them. Still, the helmet endured. It became a status symbol, a mark of bravery, and a convenient excuse for why no one could hear orders. The Middle Ages loved height. Towers, balconies, bell towers, parapets. If it could be built taller, someone immediately tried to stand on top of it and wave. Unfortunately, the medieval brain didn't fully understand gravity, and for centuries, people kept proving it existed the hard way. You'd think falling off tall things would be rare. It wasn't. Workers, priests and nobles alike plummeted from castles and cathedrals with equal enthusiasm. Stonemasons slipped on rain-slick scaffolding, monks lost balance while cleaning gargoyles, and noblewomen leaned too far out windows to get better sunlight on their tapestries. Every tower came with a view, and a casualty list. The earliest cathedrals had no guardrails, no ledges, and no concept of "don't stand there." Builders prioritised beauty, not safety. The result was a skyline full of breathtaking architecture and regular pancake-shaped employees. Records from Gothic construction sites read like workplace injury reports written by poets. Brother Thomas ascended toward heaven most directly. Eventually, nobles noticed that too many of their guests were leaving parties via the scenic route. The solution? Stone balustrades and parapets, short walls that served as the medieval equivalent of "please don't die here." They weren't added out of compassion, mind you. They were added because funerals were expensive and corpses made terrible decorations. The church adopted them next, after realising that throwing your choir boys into the courtyard every time someone fainted from incense wasn't good for morale. Builders began adding stone barriers around towers, staircases and bridges. It was revolutionary, not because it saved lives, but because it meant fewer witnesses when someone fell anyway. Of course, these early guardrails were usually knee-height, because apparently no one in the 13th century had ever seen a toddler. Drunks still tumbled over them like lemmings, knights leaned too far while showing off, and masons kept proving that occupational hazard was basically a job title. By the late Middle Ages, most large structures had some kind of railing, simple, sturdy, and built to prevent the human race from testing gravity one body at a time. It didn't stop all the falls, but it slowed the rate enough for historians to call it progress. So yes, medieval guardrails worked. They didn't stop stupidity, just delayed the inevitable landing. Medieval sanitation was a bit like medieval medicine, mostly guesswork and denial. Castles had garderobes, towns had ditches, and the average citizen had a bucket with ambition. Bathing was rare, plumbing was non-existent, and toilets were just holes with faith. And yet, somehow, even the simple act of relieving oneself found a way to kill people. The medieval privy wasn't a cosy seat of reflection. It was a cold wooden bench suspended over a pit of horrors. Sometimes it was indoors, sometimes it was attached to the castle wall, and sometimes it just emptied directly into the moat, which, incidentally, is why moats smelled like regret. These holes were deep, dark, and structurally unreliable. Basically, the Middle Ages' answer to Russian roulette. There are real records of people, nobles included, who fell straight through their toilets. Some slipped. Some leaned too far forward. Others simply sat on rotting boards and discovered gravity. One unlucky countess reportedly met her end mid-royal flush, plunging several feet into a very undignified afterlife. Chroniclers described it delicately as a sudden descent. After enough accidents, carpenters and castle builders began to make minor improvements, the medieval version of "maybe let's not die in the bathroom." Stronger boards, better hinges, and eventually the toilet lid. A wooden cover meant to keep things, and people, from falling in. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about survival. For peasants, chamber pots offered the same hazard on a smaller scale. They were left open in corners or under beds until someone kicked one over, slipped, or confused it for storage. Lids helped prevent both accidents and tragic misunderstandings, like mistaking your soup bowl for the wrong kind of stew. And while it seems laughable now, that simple piece of wood marked a major leap in medieval safety. For the first time, human waste disposal involved less human involvement. So yes, before seatbelts, fire escapes, or helmets, there was the toilet lid, civilization's earliest "do not enter" sign. It saved lives, spared dignity, and kept castles just a little less corpse-filled. In the grand scheme of human progress, it wasn't much. But for a world where you could die from sitting down, it was a victory worth flushing over. Before electricity, light came from one of two sources, the sun, or your own reckless optimism. Once the sun went down, every home, tavern and castle depended on open flames balanced on wood, near cloth, and surrounded by people with zero spatial awareness. Enter the candle, humanity's most romantic way to start a house fire. In theory, it was simple. Melt some tallow or beeswax, insert a wick, and hope for the best. In practice, it was a nightly death trap. Curtains, bed sheets, manuscripts, and hair all had equal chances of catching fire. Medieval Europe spent centuries perfecting art, faith, and architecture, but somehow never figured out not to put a candle directly under a tapestry. People died stupidly, frequently, and flammably. One careless elbow at dinner, and the host became the roast. Entire villages burned because a drunk blacksmith fell asleep with a candle beside his ale. Castles went up in flames so often that it was considered part of their natural life cycle. Construction, fire, reconstruction, repeat. Eventually, someone got tired of dying. The candle guard was born, a small metal frame placed around the flame to keep flammable objects and humans at a safe distance. It didn't take an engineer to invent it, just a survivor with eyebrows missing. Candle guards became standard in wealthy homes, made from brass or iron, symbols of both status and self-preservation. The poor, however, couldn't afford such luxuries. Peasant families used open tallow candles, which dripped, smoked, and smelled like despair. Fires were so common that local laws began regulating them. No candle shall burn unattended, which is medieval for "stop burning your house down, Gerald." Even monasteries weren't immune. Monks, who spent their lives surrounded by flammable parchment, used hundreds of candles to copy manuscripts, a profession that required steady hands and prayer that your robe didn't brush the flame. By the late Middle Ages, metal lanterns, glass holders, and hanging lamps appeared, small victories against humanity's favourite pastime, accidental self-immolation. So yes, the candle guard was one of the earliest true safety innovations. It didn't stop stupidity, it just gave it a 4-inch metal buffer zone. And considering how often people still burn themselves with scented candles today, maybe we haven't evolved all that much. If there's one thing the Middle Ages excelled at, besides plague and creative torture, it was burning things down by accident. Chief among the arsonists were the cooks. Medieval kitchens were chaos incarnate. Picture this: open hearths the size of small cars, boiling cauldrons, meat turning on spits, and apprentices running around with knives, grease, and no understanding of physics. The average kitchen fire wasn't an if, it was a when. The first problem was ventilation. There wasn't any. Kitchens filled with smoke thick enough to pickle your lungs, while sparks danced into thatched roofs like little arsonist fairies. The second problem was alcohol. Cooks drank. A lot. And nothing pairs better with flammable oil than a tipsy medieval man holding a torch. It's estimated that kitchen fires were the leading cause of castle reconstruction. Chroniclers would write things like, "The Lord's hall was consumed by flames, origin unknown." Translation: someone dropped a pig into the fire pit and didn't admit it. Eventually, the nobility decided enough was enough, mostly because their favourite castles kept burning down. Thus was born the medieval firewall, a very literal solution. Builders began constructing kitchen walls from stone instead of wood, and, revolutionary idea, moving them outside the main building. If you visit old castles today, you'll notice the kitchens are often detached, sometimes across a courtyard or in a separate annex. That wasn't architectural flair. That was centuries of culinary carnage condensed into one design choice. Keep the fire away from the important people. Large estates even introduced water barrels and sand buckets, early firefighting tech, though usually ignored until the furniture was already glowing. In monasteries, special fire watchers were assigned, which sounds noble until you realise their entire job was to stand there and yell, "It's on fire again!" Of course, the cooks didn't take this as an insult. Being moved outdoors just meant they could drink louder. So yes, the medieval firewall was genius in its simplicity. Put the flammable maniacs in their own building and hope for the best. It didn't eliminate kitchen fires, but it did make them someone else's problem. And that, in medieval engineering terms, counts as success. In the medieval mind, thunderstorms weren't weather. They were divine commentary. If lightning struck your barn, it wasn't bad luck. It was God's Yelp review of your sins. Naturally, the church decided to get involved. By the 13th century, priests had developed a bold new plan. If thunder and lightning were signs of the devil, then ringing church bells during a storm would scare him away. It made sense in that distinctly medieval way, where every idea sounds smart until someone bursts into flames. Bell towers were tall, made of stone, and equipped with long metal ropes leading straight down to the bell ringer's hands, essentially a medieval lightning rod with a volunteer attached. So whenever a storm rolled in, priests would yell, "Quick, ring the bells!" And somewhere, a poor bell ringer would take one for the team. Records show it didn't end well. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, hundreds of bell towers were struck by lightning, killing bell ringers mid-prayer. Villagers took this as proof the devil was getting angrier. Historians take it as proof that electricity doesn't care about job titles. The church eventually noticed the pattern. Every time someone tried to fight lightning with bells, lightning won. Some towns outlawed the practice, others doubled down. France even had a saying, "Celui qui sonne, sonne sa mort." Translation: he who rings, rings his death. Very poetic, very French. Finally, in the mid-17th century, Benjamin Franklin invented the lightning rod, proving you could redirect God's fury with a stick and some metal wiring. The church initially denounced it as heresy, until they realised it actually worked. Then they quietly installed them everywhere. Still, the damage had been done. For centuries, church towers remained blackened monuments to medieval optimism. Lightning didn't care about faith, prayers, or choral harmonies. It just loved a good target. And so, the bell towers became the unintentional testing grounds for early electrical theory, long before anyone knew what electrical theory was. It's hard not to admire the faith, but harder still, not to picture St. Peter sighing at the gates saying, "Another bell ringer? Let me guess, thunderstorm." If medieval Europe had a national pastime, it wasn't jousting, crusading, or even plague survival. It was drinking until something caught fire. Taverns were the social heart of every village, places to gossip, gamble, and lose several teeth over disagreements that began with, "You looked at my sheep funny. The problem?" There were no rules, no fire exits, no sobriety checks, no don't sword your neighbour policies. A medieval tavern was equal parts pub, fight club, and health hazard. The floors were sticky, the ceilings were low, and the air was 60% smoke and 40% regret. Beer was safer than water, because water could kill you, but beer just made you think you were invincible. The average ale was weak by modern standards, but people drank it constantly. Breakfast? Ale. Lunch? Ale. Dinner? Still ale. After that much barley juice, accidents weren't just possible, they were destiny. The stories are endless. Patrons falling into fireplaces mid-song, sword fights erupting over spilled drinks. One chronicler even mentioned a monk who, attempted to bless the keg, fell within and drowned piously. Medieval bartenders didn't cut you off. They just stepped aside and let natural selection handle it. Eventually, innkeepers got tired of scrubbing blood off the benches and started writing actual rules. No weapons on the table. No fighting after curfew. No sleeping in the fireplace. These weren't suggestions. They were hard-won lessons, written by men who'd spent years watching patrons burst into flames like candle wax. Some taverns installed sand buckets near the hearth, primitive fire safety measures that were mostly ignored. Others banned torches indoors, though that didn't stop drunk travellers from waving them around while shouting, "More light!" before proving why that was a bad idea. By the 14th century, even city governments got involved. In London, taverns were required to close by 9 p.m, not to maintain public order, but because the later people stayed, the higher the odds someone would lose an ear. Knighthood was supposed to be glamorous. Shining armour, noble quests, damsels fainting from admiration. What the paintings don't show is that under that glorious steel shell, the average knight was slowly cooking to death. Medieval armour was a marvel of craftsmanship and a disaster for human biology. The full plate suit was heavy, expensive, and about as breathable as a bread oven. Underneath all that metal, temperatures could rise high enough to poach a man's dignity before the enemy even arrived. Originally, knights wore armour directly over their tunics, a bold decision that quickly resulted in rashes, bruises, and what medical texts politely described as chafing of heroic proportions. You could tell a veteran by the way he walked, not from battle scars, but from thighs that had seen friction wars of their own. Eventually, someone had a revolutionary idea. Padding. A quilted undergarment called a gambeson was introduced, stuffed with wool, linen, or whatever scraps were available. It cushioned blows, absorbed sweat, and gave knights the illusion of comfort. It also trapped heat like a portable sauna. In summer campaigns, soldiers fainted mid-battle, collapsing into elegant heaps of dehydration and regret. Chroniclers loved to romanticize it. The valiant knight fell, overcome by the sun. Translation: he passed out like an overheated rotisserie chicken. Still, padding was essential. Without it, armour rubbed skin raw and left bruises deep enough to be classified as modern art. Knights who skipped it often regretted it after their first battle, or their first mile of walking. Metal got hot, cold, dented, and occasionally stuck. Removing armour after combat sometimes required 2 squires, a bucket of water, and a prayer. In the colder months, the padding was a blessing. Knights could sleep in their armour without freezing. In the summer, it was a curse, trapping sweat and body odour so potent it could repel small armies. Despite its flaws, armour padding represented genuine medieval innovation. The first real attempt at ergonomics, centuries before anyone could spell it. So yes, knights were brave. But let's be clear, they weren't glowing from divine glory. They were glowing because they were essentially wearing a personal forge. Chivalry may have been alive and well, but most of the knights under that metal smelled like death warmed over. In modern times, stained glass is seen as a masterpiece of devotion. Beautiful, sacred, radiant. In medieval times, it was also a practical safety measure. Because before those shimmering windows were installed, churches were basically open-air echo chambers where people, mostly drunk ones, regularly wandered, tripped, or fell straight through the wrong hole in God's architecture. Early medieval churches didn't even have proper glass. Windows were just empty stone frames, maybe covered with parchment or thin cloth if the congregation was lucky. That let in the light, and everything else. Pigeons, rain, thieves, and the occasional villager seeking shelter after too much ale. Many discovered gravity, holiness, and irony simultaneously. Then, sometime in the 10th century, glass-making improved, and churches realised they could use it for more than just decoration. Coloured glass wasn't just symbolic, it was practical. It reduced glare, blocked wind, and most importantly, made it obvious there was a wall there. Fewer drunks fell through the side of the nave, and fewer priests had to interrupt mass to chase out livestock. The designs were divine multitasking. Each panel told Bible stories for the illiterate, while doubling as the medieval version of "Caution, do not enter." Scenes of Judgment Day, the crucifixion, and fiery hell also served as moral reminders, or as modern architects might call them, psychological safety barriers. But stained glass wasn't foolproof. Glass was fragile, and medieval cities were rowdy. Between flying stones, bored children, and archers who missed their targets, replacing panes was a full-time job. Some parishes even hired glaziers, specialists whose entire livelihood depended on humanity's inability to aim. For the clergy, though, these windows were a win-win. They made the church safer and holier. The colourful light pouring through them created an atmosphere of awe, or mild confusion, for peasants who'd never seen anything brighter than a candle flame. To them, it wasn't safety glass, it was divine technology. So yes, stained glass was art, scripture, and accident prevention all in one. It kept out birds, sinners, and blunt objects. And for the countless villagers who mistook church walls for shortcuts on their way home from the tavern, it was the difference between divine enlightenment and divine impalement. The village well was the medieval equivalent of the town Wi-Fi. Everyone used it, everyone needed it, and everyone gathered around it to gossip. Unfortunately, it was also a gaping hole in the ground filled with water and zero safety measures, which, as it turns out, is a deadly combination for any species that walks upright and gets distracted easily. Medieval wells came in two types, open and deadly. There were no warning signs, fences or lids, just a deep shaft lined with stone and a bucket tied to a rope. During the day, people fetched water. At night, people fetched whoever fell in. Children, drunks, and livestock were the usual victims. A few chroniclers mention nobles too, which must have been quite a sight. His lordship, once of high standing, now of considerable depth. Wells were essential, but cursed. They provided clean water, when they weren't being contaminated by exactly the things that kept falling into them. Every now and then, villagers noticed the water tasting a bit strange, which was medieval code for, "There's a goat in it again." Eventually, someone had a revolutionary idea: covers. Simple wooden lids or stone slabs placed across the opening to keep out the curious, the careless, and the clumsy. Sometimes they even added hinged tops, turning the deadly pit into something almost civilized. It wasn't just about sanitation, it was about self-preservation. The first covered wells saved lives, and reduced the number of funerals that started with, "He leaned too far." Towns soon realized it was cheaper to build lids than to keep digging new holes every time the old one turned into a grave. In cities like London and Paris, public wells were covered with wooden frames, sometimes even locked at night, the medieval version of a password-protected network. Of course, these lids weren't perfect. Wood rotted, hinges broke, and people being people, someone always left it open. But statistically speaking, they made a difference. So yes, the covered well was one of the great unsung safety features of the Middle Ages, protecting humanity from its two greatest enemies, gravity and curiosity. It didn't stop people from falling into other holes, but hey, you can't fix everything in 1 century. When you think of medieval curfews, you might imagine strict law enforcement or government control. In reality, they existed for a much simpler reason. Too many people were dying stupidly after dark. You see, medieval cities at night were death traps. No streetlights, no sidewalks, no sense of direction. Just pitch-black alleys, open ditches, stray dogs, and the occasional rat the size of a loaf of bread. Combine that with cheap ale and bad depth perception, and you've got yourself a public health crisis. So, city officials introduced curfews, not out of concern for morality, but because it was exhausting to fish citizens out of wells and sewers every morning. When the bell rang at sunset, that was your cue. Go home, bolt the door, and pray the guy with the torch outside knew what he was doing. The word curfew itself comes from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. Because open flames and wooden cities didn't mix well, everyone was required to extinguish their hearths at night. Failure to comply often ended with your neighbourhood joining the scenic pile of ash collection. Of course, the average citizen didn't take the curfew seriously. The taverns stayed open, the drunks stayed drunk, and the city guards, underpaid and undermotivated, spent most of their shifts shouting, "Who goes there?" into the void. Some towns even introduced fines for wandering after dark, though given the survival rate, that was basically a posthumous tax. The problem wasn't just darkness, it was design. Medieval cities were mazes of narrow lanes, random staircases, and open drains. Fall into the wrong alley and you might never come out, especially if you were wearing full wool and regret. Still, the curfew worked well enough to reduce the nightly death toll. In London, bells tolled at 9 to signal lights out. In Paris, guards patrolled with lanterns and impressive levels of self-loathing. And in smaller towns, people just assumed anyone walking around after dark was either a thief or terminally stupid. So yes, medieval curfews were the first form of public safety regulation. They didn't protect freedom, they protected fools. Because if you're stumbling home drunk in a pitch-black street full of open sewers, what you need isn't liberty, it's supervision. If you've ever seen a plague doctor and thought, that looks like a man auditioning for a horror film, you're not wrong. But in the Middle Ages, that terrifying outfit was considered cutting-edge medical technology, which tells you a lot about how medicine was going. When the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, nobody understood germs. People blamed bad smells, divine wrath, or foreigners. The medieval holy trinity of scapegoats. Physicians, desperate to survive their patients, decided the solution was to look like death itself. The result was the plague doctor costume. A long waxed coat, leather gloves, boots, and the iconic beaked mask. Inside that beak was a mix of herbs, spices, and dried flowers. Basically, medieval potpourri. The idea was simple. If the air smelled bad, it could kill you. So mask it with something that smelled slightly less like decay. It didn't work, of course. But here's the thing. It accidentally did something useful. The full body covering created a primitive barrier against fleas, which actually were spreading the plague. So by sheer dumb luck, the bird of death costume might have saved more lives than the doctor's medical knowledge ever did. Still, these doctors weren't exactly comforting. Imagine you're dying in agony, and the door bursts open to reveal a 6-foot raven holding a stick. The stick wasn't a weapon. It was for poking you from a safe distance because nothing says compassionate care like not wanting to stand too close. Their waxed coats could be wiped clean of contagion, though given hygiene standards of the time, clean was a relative term. Some even carried vials of vinegar to rinse their masks between patients, which worked about as well as spraying perfume on a corpse. To the terrified public, plague doctors looked like omens, and honestly they were. When one showed up on your street, it meant everyone within coughing distance had about a week to start writing wills. So yes, the plague doctor suit was medieval safety gear, equal parts genius and nightmare fuel. It didn't stop the plague, but it did achieve something almost as impressive. It made people wish for a quick death just to avoid seeing it again. Medieval bridges were miracles of engineering, right up until people used them. Built from stone, wood, or whatever the local lord had lying around, they were crucial for trade, travel, and the occasional stampede of pilgrims who refused to slow down. And that's where the trouble began. The Middle Ages didn't have traffic control. When a festival, market, or miracle happened, thousands of people would flood the nearest bridge like a migrating herd. Add in animals, wagons, and the medieval disregard for personal space, and you had the perfect recipe for a news headline that would have read, "Hundreds drowned during celebration of life." One of the most famous examples was the London Bridge disaster of 1282, when a massive crowd gathered to watch a nightly tournament and promptly collapsed part of the structure into the Thames. Chroniclers recorded, "Many perished in the water," which is medieval shorthand for everyone ignored basic physics. The solution? Bridge chains and gates. Officials began installing barriers to limit how many people could cross at once. Some were wooden gates, others were iron chains. Simple, sturdy, and utterly necessary since common sense had clearly drowned decades earlier. Guards were stationed to count carts and people. Although medieval math being what it was, limit often meant until it creaks. Of course, these measures weren't just for safety. Lords quickly realised that controlling bridge access meant they could also collect tolls. Nothing says public safety like monetising it. So yes, bridge gates saved lives, but also funded new bridges to replace the ones that inevitably still collapsed. Despite improvements, bridge disasters kept happening. People panicked easily, horses panicked faster, and most bridges weren't designed to hold hundreds of panicking things at once. So towns started adding side railings and thicker supports, and in some places simply banned dancing on bridges, which apparently had to be specified. By the late Middle Ages, bridges had evolved from death traps into slightly sturdier death traps. But the principle held: one chain, one gate, and one guard with authority over gravity. So yes, the medieval bridge was both progress and punishment. It connected people, carried trade, and occasionally reminded everyone that physics is undefeated. In the Middle Ages, the fireplace was the heart of the home, and also quite often the cause of death. Before chimneys became standard, indoor fires were set in open hearths, right in the middle of the floor, because nothing says domestic bliss like lighting a bonfire inside your wooden house. The logic was simple: fire equals heat, heat equals life. The problem was that smoke also equals suffocation. Medieval architects didn't really grasp ventilation. They built homes like sealed boxes, and then acted surprised when everyone inside started coughing like a choir of dying donkeys. Early attempts at smoke management were creative in the way only desperate people can be. Some households cut a hole in the roof, a sort of DIY chimney that also doubled as a rain collector. Others hung pots or wet cloth above the fire to trap the smoke, which worked as well as it sounds. The result? Blackened walls, asphyxiated residents, and neighbours wondering why the Joneses hadn't moved in days. Finally, someone had a revolutionary idea: the fireplace hood. A simple funnel-like structure built above the fire, designed to guide smoke up and out instead of directly into everyone's lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. It allowed homes to keep warm without accidentally recreating the atmosphere of Mordor. Wealthier homes and castles soon adopted them, often building grand stone hoods that became early ancestors of the chimney. For peasants, though, the technology took a little longer. And by a little, we mean several centuries. In the meantime, most simply lived with the constant haze, because oxygen was overrated and soot was free. Even with the invention of proper chimneys, accidents continued. Birds built nests in the flues, trapping smoke until the entire room turned into a medieval gas chamber. Chimney sweeps became an actual profession, though professional might be a stretch when your job involves crawling into a burning hole for a few coins and no dental plan. Still, the fireplace hood marked one of the great unsung leaps in safety, saving lives, reducing lung damage, and making the Middle Ages just a little less smoky. Medieval convents were supposed to be places of purity, where women withdrew from the world to live for God alone. But if you stepped quietly through the cloisters at night, you might have heard something very different from prayer. Laughter, whispers, the creak of forbidden footsteps. Because beneath the pious surface of medieval monastic life, something far more human was often stirring. Many of these women had never wanted to be there in the first place. Daughters of nobles were routinely donated to the church, not out of divine calling, but to save on dowries or protect family inheritance. Some were sent to atone for their father's sins, others because they had no husband or too many opinions. To the outside world, they were brides of Christ. But to many inside, they were prisoners dressed in linen and bound by vows they never chose. In the beginning, the rules were strict. Silence at meals, fasting, long hours of prayer. Yet human nature is stubborn. The walls that kept men out couldn't keep temptation in. The smallest gestures, a letter slipped through the grating, a song hummed in Latin with suggestive undertones, became tiny rebellions. And soon, rebellion grew bolder. There were nuns who brewed wine and smuggled it past abbesses, others who met local priests or travellers in the garden cloisters. Some even disguised themselves and sneaked into nearby villages during feast days. The church turned a blind eye, at least until rumours became scandals. Chroniclers of the time, mostly male monks, were both shocked and fascinated. They wrote of immodest behaviour, of sisters corrupted by fleshly desires. Some reports spoke of secret pregnancies and infants mysteriously buried in monastery gardens. Others mentioned visions, nuns claiming to see angels or Christ himself in moments of ecstatic trance. Historians still debate how many of these were genuine religious experiences, and how many were attempts to mask forbidden passion behind a veil of mysticism. The convent, meant to be a fortress of purity, had become a mirror of the world it tried to shut out, full of longing, guilt, and desire. And in those echoing halls, the whispers never really stopped. For many women, the convent was less a sanctuary and more a cage gilded with hymns. It was a world where time crawled, marked by the ringing of bells rather than the beating of hearts. Some arrived as children, barely old enough to hold a quill, told they were chosen by God. But most knew the truth. They had been chosen by their family's convenience. Life inside followed a pattern that could drive anyone to madness. Dawn prayers, work, silence, study, and more prayers. All under the watchful eye of the abbess. The walls were high enough to block both temptation and sunlight, and any glimpse of freedom was considered sin. The smallest mistake, speaking during silence, giggling at supper, or daydreaming during Mass, could earn a harsh penance. Kneeling for hours on stone floors, fasting for days, or sleeping without blankets in the cold, some women accepted their fate with grim devotion, but others began to imagine ways to feel alive again. They embroidered secret messages into altar cloths, wrote love letters disguised as hymns, and exchanged longing glances with confessors who were supposed to guide their souls, not tempt their flesh. When you live a life of enforced purity, even a look can feel like a rebellion. Not all convents were equal. Wealthier ones resembled miniature courts, filled with noble daughters who brought their servants, their luxuries, and their vanity with them. They wore fine linen under their habits, painted their lips with berries, and held whispered feasts in hidden chambers. Poorer convents, by contrast, suffered from hunger and isolation, their sisters surviving on scraps and hope. But in both kinds, temptation found a way to bloom like ivy through cracks in stone. The church tried to keep things orderly. Inspectors were occasionally sent to reform unruly convents, but these visits often revealed more than Rome wanted to hear. One chronicler confessed that after visiting several nunneries, he feared for his own soul. "The devil walks in petticoats there," he wrote. For many of these women, faith and frustration lived side by side. They prayed to be pure, yet dreamed of love. They called themselves brides of Christ, but behind the veil, many were still just women, yearning, restless, and very much alive. Temptation has a way of finding its way through even the thickest walls. In medieval convents, it arrived quietly, a smile from a visiting monk, the warmth of a candlelit confession, the simple act of being seen by someone after years of invisibility. For women trapped in a lifetime of obedience, the smallest flicker of attention could ignite an inferno. Priests and monks often served as confessors to nuns, and their presence blurred the line between the sacred and the sinful. These men were meant to guide, absolve, and protect. Yet some became enamored by the same women they were supposed to keep pure. In confessionals, whispers of sin became whispers of desire. A trembling voice admitting impure thoughts was sometimes met not with chastisement, but with understanding, even longing. Many of these relationships began as spiritual intimacy and spiraled into something far more physical. Records from the time tell of priests sneaking into convent dormitories at night. Some built secret tunnels or bribed gatekeepers. One chronicler described how holy fathers entered not through the gates, but through the heart. It was poetry to some, scandal to the church. When discovered, the punishments were brutal. The men were defrocked or executed. The nuns, shorn of their hair, were locked in their cells for life or made to do public penance, barefoot, whipped, and humiliated before the altar. But punishment didn't erase desire. It only drove it deeper underground. Many nuns hid their affairs under the guise of divine visions. When caught trembling in ecstasy, they claimed to be receiving the embrace of Christ. Mysticism became the perfect disguise. The more holy their rapture appeared, the less anyone dared to question it. Some even rose to fame as visionaries, venerated for what was, in truth, forbidden passion turned into spiritual theatre. The convent was now a strange paradox, a place where love was both condemned and sanctified, depending on how cleverly it was hidden. Behind the cloister walls, desire wore a rosary and spoke in Latin. And while the world outside imagined the nuns praying in perfect devotion, the truth was far more human and far more dangerous. By the 13th century, mysticism had become the perfect cloak for everything the Church didn't want to see. Visions, trances, and divine ecstasies were praised as signs of holiness, but in some convents they became the language of secret pleasure. When a nun fell into a swoon during prayer, trembling and gasping that Christ had entered her soul, no one dared to question the nature of her rapture. The boundary between divine union and carnal ecstasy blurred until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. Some of the most famous women of the Middle Ages walked this dangerous line. Take Sister Agnes of Montepulciano, who claimed angels carried her into the arms of Christ nightly, or the mysterious Sister Benedetta Carlini, whose visions in the 17th century were later revealed to be love affairs disguised as miracles. But long before Benedetta, the pattern was well established. When desire became too dangerous to express, it wore the mask of divinity. For many nuns, mystical language became a kind of code, one that only other women understood. "My beloved pierced me with his flame," one wrote in her diary, describing what sounded suspiciously less like theology and more like passion. Another spoke of sweet wounds of divine fire, a poetic veil for forbidden touch. These women weren't necessarily liars or heretics. They were trapped souls finding the only language available to describe longing. And in a world where female desire was considered dangerous, it was safer to call it holy. The Church itself encouraged such expressions, at least at first. A woman lost in rapture made for excellent propaganda, proof that even the weakest vessels could feel divine grace. But once these visions turned too sensual, too uncontrollable, the tone shifted. Bishops grew suspicious. Priests recorded unseemly behaviours during ecstatic states. Convents were raided, journals burned, and nuns accused of consorting with demons rather than angels. And yet the veil of ecstasy endured. Behind closed doors, it gave women a way to reclaim their bodies, even if only in metaphor. In a world ruled by men, the mystic's trance was the one form of rebellion that looked like devotion. And for many, it was the only freedom they'd ever know. Where there is desire, there are consequences. And in the cloistered world of medieval convents, those consequences were impossible to hide forever. Behind the chants and incense, some sisters carried more than secrets. They carried life itself. The archives of medieval Europe whisper of pregnancies concealed beneath heavy habits, of infants smuggled out through convent kitchens or buried beneath herb gardens where only the moon bore witness. It was not as rare as the Church wanted people to believe. In many regions, France, Italy, Germany, bishops conducted investigations after rumours of unholy births. One report from 1320 described a convent where several sisters had fallen, and one produced a child by a travelling friar. The abbess, desperate to preserve the convent's reputation, claimed the infant was miraculously conceived, a holy child sent by divine will. The bishop was unconvinced. The baby vanished by nightfall. Love affairs between nuns and priests were especially dangerous because they struck at the core of church authority. These were people who had taken sacred vows, betraying not only their God, but their entire community. Yet the human heart has little regard for vows. In letters later discovered hidden behind altar panels, nuns wrote of love that defied sin. "I have known the touch of heaven, and it was yours." For them, such passion wasn't wicked. It was salvation, but discovery was ruin. When a nun's pregnancy became visible, she faced lifelong imprisonment in a walled-up cell. Some were forced to carry their infants to term in secret and watch them taken away by strangers. The fathers, if they were priests or monks, often escaped with little more than reassignment or a private confession. These tragedies gave rise to rumours of ghostly cries echoing through convent corridors, the souls of infants who never saw daylight. It's impossible to separate truth from legend now. Many of these stories were spread by Protestant reformers centuries later to smear the Catholic Church. But even if some were exaggerated, the silence of official records says enough. Because where history refuses to speak, the earth remembers. And beneath the gardens of many forgotten convents, the soil still hides what the sisters could not confess. Some convents became infamous, whispered about in taverns and confessions alike, not for their holiness, but for the men who visited them. Certain abbots, bishops, and even local lords treated nunneries like private retreats, their walls offering both discretion and luxury. Donations flowed in exchange for special prayers, but everyone knew that some prayers came with wine, laughter, and locked doors. The church hierarchy was tangled in hypocrisy. Bishops would publicly condemn the moral decay of monasteries while maintaining their own secret mistresses, often nuns. In 12th century France, one such bishop was caught keeping a young sister as his spiritual companion. When confronted, he defended himself with absurd logic. Better a nun than a harlot. His superiors quietly transferred him to another diocese, while the woman disappeared from the records altogether. In England, certain convents were notorious for their hospitality. Visitors described them as places where holiness wore perfume. The abbess of one wealthy priory reportedly hosted evening feasts, where nobles and monks dined together behind drawn curtains. Music, laughter, and sometimes scandalous games followed. The church eventually intervened, not because of sin, but because such rumours drew public embarrassment. The abbess was replaced, though her guests simply found another door to knock on. Money, too, played its role. Noble families often showered convents with gold to secure salvation, or to keep certain secrets buried. A generous patron could guarantee silence if one of his indiscretions involved a sister within the cloister. The church, ever pragmatic, preferred a quiet bribe to a noisy scandal. And yet, amidst all this corruption, there were also women trying to live sincerely. They prayed, taught, tended gardens, and copied manuscripts. They endured the same suspicion cast upon their more reckless sisters. To the world outside, all nuns shared the same reputation, either saints or seductresses, never simply human. In truth, the convent was both heaven and hell, a place of devotion corrupted by desire, of isolation twisted into intimacy. The abbots who called these women brides of Christ treated them as property of men. And for every pious prayer whispered at dawn, there was a secret vow whispered at midnight, one that no rosary could ever absolve. When the veil of secrecy finally tore, punishment came swift and merciless. The church, desperate to preserve its image, made examples out of fallen nuns. Penance in the medieval world was not about forgiveness, it was about control. To sin was human, but to publicly suffer was divine theatre, a warning to every woman who dared follow her desires inside holy walls. Punishments varied from brutal confinement to lifelong humiliation. A nun found guilty of fornication could be stripped of her habit and made to walk barefoot through the streets, a rope around her neck, while townsfolk spat and mocked her. Others were sealed into small stone cells, immured alive, with only a slit through which food and communion were passed. They prayed until madness took them, or until they simply stopped breathing. The church called it repentance. History calls it cruelty wrapped in sanctity. Yet not all penances were physical. Some were psychological, designed to break the will rather than the body. A sister might be forced to serve in silence for decades, never spoken to again by her peers, a ghost among the living. Others were sent to remote monasteries, exiled to cold mountains or swamps where no confession could reach them. And always, the blame fell harder on women. The priests or monks involved were often quietly reassigned, their sins washed away with holy water and influence. Despite these punishments, scandals kept resurfacing. Some church officials even admitted that the cloister system itself invited sin, locking men and women into unnatural extremes of suppression and temptation. The Inquisition took particular interest in convent corruption, often blurring the line between discipline and persecution. Torture was justified under the banner of purging demonic influence, as if lust itself were the devil's whisper. And yet, even in the face of torment, some nuns refused to repent. They confessed their love without shame, claiming that God himself had made them feel alive. One condemned sister, before being locked away, said to her accuser, "If he did not want us to love, he would not have given us hearts." Her words were erased from official records, but not from memory. Within those walls, the human spirit kept flickering, defying the very faith meant to extinguish it. Not every nun bowed her head in shame or silence. In a world that demanded obedience, some convents quietly turned into hubs of defiance. These were the rebellious sisters, women who read forbidden books, mocked their abbesses, and challenged the authority of priests. For them, rebellion was not always about lust. It was about freedom, the right to think, to feel, and to choose their own kind of holiness. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a number of nunneries became centres of learning and writing. Within their walls, women read works that men thought too dangerous: theology, philosophy, and even poetry. The abbess Hildegard of Bingen, though celebrated as a saint today, was herself reprimanded for preaching without male supervision. Others wrote letters questioning the Church's treatment of women, though they signed them with false names to avoid punishment. Their quills became weapons, their ink a form of quiet revolution. Then there were the sisters who rebelled in more carnal ways. In some convents, nuns threw off their habits and joined travelling minstrels or escaped with lovers. A convent in Cologne became so notorious for nightly escapes that city guards had to patrol the perimeter. When caught, the women claimed they only sought fresh air. Authorities didn't laugh, but neither could they stop them entirely. A few convents turned their defiance into open mockery. Chronicles tell of sisters who replaced psalms with bawdy songs, or who danced in the refectory after dark. One German abbess was said to have kept pet peacocks, musicians, and barrels of wine for spiritual celebration. The line between blasphemy and joy blurred so completely that even visiting bishops weren't sure whether to condemn or envy them. But rebellion had a price. The Church responded with reforms, stricter enclosures, and surveillance. Iron bars were added to windows, walls were raised higher, and male confessors were forbidden from being alone with any sister. Yet rebellion, like desire, has a way of surviving even stone. For every woman who submitted, another whispered her defiance into the night. Her laughter carried through the corridors like a hymn of freedom. The rebellious sisters might have been silenced, but their spirit outlived their punishments. And in that quiet defiance, the first cracks in the Church's authority began to form. By the end of the Middle Ages, Europe's convents stood as paradoxes carved in stone, symbols of purity tainted by rumour, and sanctuaries that hid both saints and sinners. The scandals that once rocked the Church didn't erase these institutions. They reshaped them. Behind every veil was a story of faith, rebellion, punishment, and survival. And when the Renaissance dawned, the whispers that once trembled behind cloister doors spilled into books, satire, and art. Writers like Boccaccio, Chaucer, and later Voltaire turned the sinful nun into a cultural icon, the embodiment of hypocrisy and suppressed desire. Their tales may have exaggerated the truth, but they were built on centuries of real scandal. To the Church, these stories were slander. To historians, they were windows into human frailty. The nuns of old were no longer just brides of Christ. They were tragic heroines caught between faith and flesh. Yet, amid the scandal, it's easy to forget that many sisters truly sought God. They ran hospitals, taught orphans, copied sacred manuscripts, and brought light to a dark world. Their piety was genuine, even as others around them faltered. But history rarely rewards moderation. It remembers the extremes, the ecstatic visions, the forbidden lovers, the buried children. Those were the tales that survived, because sin makes better stories than virtue. When the Protestant Reformation erupted in the 16th century, reformers seized on these scandals as proof of Catholic corruption. Pamphlets described convents as brothels of Babylon, their nuns as handmaidens of lust. Some monasteries were burned, others dissolved entirely, and with them vanished centuries of art, writing, and knowledge. Much of it the work of women whose names the world will never know. Still, their voices echo faintly through time, in songs, in fragments of letters, in the quiet defiance of their choices. They remind us that behind every rule, every vow, and every accusation of sin, there were human beings, flawed, passionate, and alive. The scandals of medieval convents weren't just stories of lust. They were stories of longing for something more. Freedom, connection, understanding. The walls may have been built to contain them, but their whispers outlived the stones. And centuries later, those whispers still ask the same forbidden question. What does it truly mean to be holy? When Edward II inherited the English throne in 1307, few imagined how different he would be from his father. Edward I had been a towering symbol of medieval kingship, ruthless, commanding, and utterly devoted to conquest. His son, however, was cut from a softer cloth. The young king preferred music to war drums, laughter to sermons, and the company of charming men to that of scheming nobles. He was tall, athletic, and strikingly handsome, fond of swimming, rowing, and performing manual labour alongside commoners. This was unheard of for a medieval monarch. The son of the Hammer of the Scots was seen hauling stones with masons, mingling with servants and playing rustic games in the fields. To the court this was not humility, it was humiliation. The barons whispered that their king was acting beneath his station, but Edward didn't care. He had always been an emotional man, drawn to intensity, loyalty, and beauty in others. And none embodied those qualities more than Piers Gaveston, a dashing knight from Gascony who had once served as his father's page. The moment Edward met him, something sparked, a friendship so deep, so consuming, that even chroniclers of the time could only describe it as love. When his father banished Gaveston for being a corrupting influence, Edward was furious. As soon as he became king, one of his first acts was to recall Piers, showering him with titles, jewels, and lands that should have gone to England's most powerful lords. He even made Gaveston Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for royalty. It was an unmistakable statement. Piers Gaveston was not merely a friend. He was the king's chosen one. This favouritism ignited fury among the barons. They saw it as an insult, an outrage, and a danger. But for Edward, it was simply devotion. He called Gaveston his brother, my dearest, and filled court life with lavish entertainments where the two appeared inseparable. Chroniclers wrote of their affection with both awe and disgust. To many, Edward's love seemed unnatural, a challenge not only to custom, but to God himself. England had seen cruel kings, foolish kings, even mad kings. But never before had it seen a king who loved another man more than his own crown. Piers Gaveston was not born into greatness. The son of a Gascon knight, he rose through charm, talent, and an unshakable confidence that bordered on arrogance. When he first entered the royal household, he was quick-witted, handsome, and dangerously magnetic, the kind of man who could make even a prince forget his duties. And that's exactly what happened. Edward II adored him. Piers made the young king laugh when others made him yawn. He was bold enough to tease him, to dance with him, to challenge him in ways no noble dared. In an age when power demanded distance, Gaveston's familiarity was intoxicating. To Edward, he was not a servant. He was sunlight in a kingdom of grey. When Edward ascended the throne, Gaveston's fortune soared with him. The new king rewarded his beloved companion with titles that sent shockwaves through the nobility. He made Piers Earl of Cornwall, a title so sacred that even Edward's own brothers had been denied it. To the barons, this was unforgivable. To Edward, it was love and loyalty repaid. But Piers didn't make things easier for himself. He mocked the great lords of England, giving them cruel nicknames, calling one the Black Dog of Arden and another Burst Belly. He strutted through court in silk, surrounded by musicians and flatterers, flaunting jewels finer than the king's. He accompanied Edward everywhere, in council, in battle, even in bedchambers. Chroniclers claimed they dined from the same plate and wore matching clothes. Whether that was fact or gossip, no one could deny the intimacy between them. The court seethed. The barons felt humiliated, the Queen's relatives insulted, and the old guard of Edward's father's reign horrified. They began plotting. The Archbishop of Canterbury warned the king that Gaveston's arrogance would destroy him. Even Parliament demanded Piers' exile, calling him the corrupter of the realm. Edward reluctantly agreed, but his heart broke as Piers left England. Chroniclers say the king wept openly, sending lavish gifts after him and promising a swift return. He wrote, "My brother Piers, my joy, return to me soon." But exile could not separate them for long. Edward was not just a king, he was a man in love. And in defying his barons to bring Gaveston back, he unknowingly signed his own political death warrant. When Piers Gaveston returned from exile in 1309, England trembled. The barons had forced his departure once, but Edward's heart refused to let him stay away. The king welcomed him back with feasts and gifts, proclaiming his return as a triumph of loyalty. To the nobles it felt more like betrayal. They had warned the king, and now he was mocking them. Gaveston's arrogance only grew. He rode through London with golden armour and a jewelled sword, flanked by guards who saluted him as if he were king himself. His coat of arms glittered beside the royal banner. Even the coronation of Queen Isabella, Edward's new French bride, was overshadowed by his presence. Chroniclers claimed that while the Queen sat ignored, Edward's eyes never left Gaveston's face. The insult was impossible to forget. The barons, now united in outrage, swore to destroy him. They called themselves the Lords Ordainers, a coalition of England's most powerful men. They claimed to act for the good of the kingdom, but in truth, it was vengeance. They accused Gaveston of corrupting the king, draining the treasury and dividing the realm. Parliament exiled him again, this time threatening death should he return. But Edward defied them. Once more he recalled his beloved companion, hiding him in castles, protecting him with soldiers, and defying every demand for obedience. Love made Edward reckless, and his enemies took advantage. In 1312, while the king and Gaveston were travelling, the Earl of Lancaster and his allies struck. They captured the royal favourite near Scarborough and dragged him south in chains. Edward begged for mercy, sending letters, envoys, and promises. None of it mattered. The barons despised Gaveston too much to let him live. At Warwick Castle, without trial or pardon, Piers was condemned as a traitor. On a grey June morning, he was led to Blacklow Hill, mocked by soldiers who once bowed before him. There they ran him through with a sword and left his body to rot in the open air. When Edward heard the news, he fell into grief and fury so deep it frightened even his allies. Gaveston was gone, but in death he became legend. The king's obsession had cost him his greatest love, and soon it would cost him his crown. When Queen Isabella arrived in England as a young bride, she expected a royal husband, not a rival. The daughter of France's powerful King Philip IV, she had been raised to command respect. Yet her new husband, Edward II, barely looked at her. His gaze, his affection, and his loyalty all belonged to Piers Gaveston. During her coronation, Edward had seated Gaveston beside him in royal robes, while Isabella, the Queen of England, was treated like an afterthought. It was a humiliation she would never forgive. After Gaveston's death, Isabella played the part of the dutiful wife, comforting Edward through his grief. But inside she was watching, learning, and waiting. She saw how her husband clung to memories of his lost companion, how he alienated the nobility, and how his rule began to crumble. When he turned his affection toward a new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, Isabella recognised the same dangerous pattern repeating. Despenser was ambitious, cunning, and far more ruthless than Gaveston had ever been. He used the king's affection to seize lands, wealth, and power. Nobles who opposed him were imprisoned or executed. Even Isabella's own lands were confiscated. England groaned under the weight of their greed. For the Queen, it was not just insult now, it was survival. In 1325, Edward sent Isabella to France to negotiate with her brother, the new French king. Once there, she refused to return. She declared that she would not return to my lord while that man, Despenser, stands beside him. Then she did something no medieval queen had ever dared. She gathered an army. With the help of English exiles and her rumoured lover, Roger Mortimer, she plotted the invasion of her own husband's kingdom. When Isabella landed in England in 1326, the nation turned against its king overnight. Nobles flocked to her banner. Towns opened their gates. Edward and Despenser fled in panic, their power dissolving in weeks. The Queen, who had once been humiliated, now led an army of vengeance, and she was coming for them both. By winter, Edward II, once the anointed King of England, was a fugitive. And beside Isabella rode Mortimer, the man who would help her finish what Gaveston's death had started. The autumn of 1326 turned England into a kingdom of betrayal. As Queen Isabella's forces advanced from the south, Edward II found himself abandoned by everyone he had ever trusted. Nobles defected, sheriffs opened their gates, and even the clergy blessed the Queen's rebellion. The once mighty king was reduced to a desperate wanderer, dragging his remaining followers, and Hugh Despenser the Younger, through rain-soaked countryside, searching for shelter in a land that no longer wanted him. Everywhere he went, doors closed. Even the Welsh marches, his supposed stronghold, turned against him. The chroniclers describe the king and Despenser disguised as monks, slipping from one abbey to another, hungry and terrified. But the hunt was relentless. The Queen's men tracked them across the coast, cutting off every path to escape. In November, they were finally cornered near Neath in South Wales. There, the king was betrayed by his own servants and captured without a fight. The fall of Hugh Despenser was far less merciful. Dragged in chains to Hereford, he faced Isabella's fury in full view of the people. They hated him more than anyone alive, the man who had corrupted their king, stolen their lands, and ruled through terror. His trial was a mockery, his sentence pure vengeance. He was hanged, cut down alive, castrated, and disemboweled before a jeering crowd. His body was quartered, his head nailed to London Bridge. Isabella and Mortimer watched from a platform, silent and satisfied. As for Edward, he was a prisoner now, not in name, but in truth. Stripped of his crown, he was taken to Kenilworth Castle, where Parliament formally deposed him. The once proud ruler sat in chains as the Archbishop declared his young son, Edward III, the new king. The crowd cheered. The deposed monarch wept. In theory, Isabella promised to keep her husband alive under honourable custody. In practice, few believed she intended mercy. Mortimer's power depended on Edward's silence, and Isabella's vengeance was not yet complete. England's most tragic king was now a ghost in his own realm, surrounded by guards loyal to his enemies, and somewhere deep within his cell, he must have wondered which would come first, forgiveness from his god or death from his wife. After his capture, Edward II was taken from one fortress to another. A fallen king passed between his captors like an inconvenient burden. Eventually, he was delivered to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, a grim fortress surrounded by swamps and guarded by men loyal to Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer. His fate was uncertain, but few doubted that death would soon follow. At first, the Queen claimed she wished to keep her husband in safety and comfort. Yet the reports that trickled out of Berkeley told a different story. Locals spoke of the king being kept in a cold, damp cell, denied proper food, and woken at night by guards hammering on the doors to prevent him from sleeping. Some claimed he was tormented by the sounds of trumpets and laughter outside, the mockery of those celebrating his downfall. Edward's spirit began to collapse. This was a man who had once ruled all England, now reduced to a ghost whispering prayers to guards who despised him. His only companions were memories of Gaveston's laughter, of youth and sunlight long gone. Letters from sympathisers were intercepted. Even attempts to free him were brutally crushed. The more his supporters plotted, the tighter his captor's grip became. In the summer of 1327, a rebellion briefly erupted in Wales, hoping to restore the deposed monarch. It failed, but it terrified Isabella and Mortimer. They feared Edward's continued existence might inspire a greater revolt. Soon after, a cryptic message was sent to Berkeley. Edward of Caernarfon must die without manner of violence. The meaning was clear. Kill him, but leave no mark of murder. What happened next would become one of history's most infamous mysteries. Chroniclers claimed that one September night, Edward was pinned beneath a mattress to muffle his screams, and a red-hot poker was inserted into his body to destroy him from within. A punishment both cruel and symbolic, meant to mock the king's rumoured passions. Others insist he was quietly strangled or starved. Whatever the truth, Edward II was dead by morning. His body, they said, bore no wounds, just a face twisted in agony. The castle's bells tolled softly that dawn, announcing not a royal death, but the silencing of England's most scandalous love. The official story was clear. Edward II died in September 1327 at Berkeley Castle. His body was displayed to ensure everyone knew the king was truly gone. A funeral was held in Gloucester Abbey, where a coffin was placed before weeping courtiers and guarded day and night. But from the beginning, something didn't add up. The body, some whispered, didn't look like Edward's. The face was unrecognisable, disfigured beyond recognition. Others noted that the coffin was sealed before many could view it, and then came the rumours that the former king had, in fact, survived his supposed execution. Within a year of his death, sightings began to spread. A hermit in the Welsh mountains claimed a gaunt man had appeared at his hut one stormy night, dressed in rags but speaking like a noble. In Ireland, there were reports of a stranger calling himself William the Carpenter, who seemed to know too much about royal affairs. Even in Germany, a story emerged of a wandering penitent who spoke fluent English and bore the bearing of a fallen king. Most historians dismiss these tales as hopeful myth, a way for Edward's sympathisers to imagine he'd escaped the cruelty of his fate. But some evidence lingers in royal letters. A 1338 document, written by a papal envoy, claimed that Edward was alive and living in exile in Italy under protection of a monastery. The letter described him as penitent, bearded and broken, yet at peace. Whether that was truth or political rumour, no one knows. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, however, acted like people haunted by ghosts. They refused to discuss Edward's death in detail, avoided Berkeley, and reportedly suffered terrible nightmares. Isabella had a golden shrine built for his soul, but never visited it. Mortimer, meanwhile, tightened his grip on power, as if expecting retribution from a man who might still walk the earth. For the common people, the tale of the living king became legend. Some whispered he had fled to the continent to live as a monk. Others said he wandered the forests of Wales, cursing his betrayers. Whether Edward survived or not, one thing was certain. His story refused to die. In England's imagination, he would forever be both martyr and monster, the king who loved too deeply to rule and suffered too brutally to be forgotten. For a brief, dazzling moment, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer ruled England like sovereigns. The young Edward III, only 14, was king in name, but his mother and her lover held the real power. They lived in luxury, hosting grand feasts at Nottingham and Wallingford, while the court whispered of their passion. Mortimer, Once a mere baron, now signed royal decrees, wore cloth of gold, and was called the King of Folly by those too fearful to speak his true title, the Queen's paramour. But the pair's victory soon began to rot. Their alliance had been built on vengeance, not loyalty. Nobles who had once supported them against Edward II now resented Mortimer's arrogance and greed. He seized lands, punished rivals, and enriched himself shamelessly. Even Isabella's charm began to fade as the people whispered that she had murdered her husband and defiled her crown. The young Edward III watched it all in silence. Outwardly obedient, he played the role of the submissive son. Inwardly, he burned with humiliation. His father had been dethroned, tortured, and killed, and now his mother ruled through the man who had done it. Every document Mortimer signed in Edward's name was another insult. By 1330, the tension had reached its breaking point. Edward was now 17, old enough to act. One October night, while Isabella and Mortimer slept in Nottingham Castle, the young king's loyal supporters crept through a secret tunnel known only to the castle's guards. They burst into the royal apartments and seized Mortimer, who was dragged away half-dressed, begging for mercy. Isabella screamed for her son, but Edward stood firm. "You have ruled too long," he told her. Mortimer was swiftly condemned without trial. He was hanged at Tyburn, his body left dangling as a warning. Isabella was spared execution, but confined to a quiet life in comfortable exile. The so-called she-wolf of France, who had destroyed one king and crowned another, ended her days in sorrow and silence, haunted by the ghosts of her past. The reign of terror had ended, but the stain it left on England would never fade. The young Edward III had reclaimed his crown, but it was won with blood, his father's, his mother's, and his nation's. History has not been kind to Edward II. To his enemies he was a weak king, careless, indulgent, and ruled by his passions. To others, he was a tragic figure, a man out of step with his time, condemned for loving too openly in an age that could not understand him. Centuries later, his story still divides historians. Was he a fool destroyed by infatuation, or a sensitive ruler punished for being different? In life, Edward defied the rigid masculinity expected of medieval kingship. He preferred music to war, friendship to politics, affection to strategy. But those qualities, seen as virtues today, were fatal flaws in his world. His love for Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser challenged the order of feudal loyalty. Kings were supposed to command obedience, not give their hearts away. To the barons, his favouritism looked like weakness. To the church, his intimacy with men was sin. Yet even his failures left an imprint. The brutality of his downfall, the political manipulation, the regicide, the rumours of torture, scarred England's monarchy for generations. His son, Edward III, would rule with iron discipline, determined never to repeat his father's mistakes. The lessons of Edward's reign shaped the very image of kingship, one of restraint, caution, and fear of emotional entanglement. As for Isabella, the so-called she-wolf of France, she ended her life quietly in a convent, dressed in grey, haunted by guilt. Before her death, she reportedly requested to be buried with a silver cross, inside of which was a small image of her late husband. Whether it was remorse or superstition, no one could say. Mortimer's name became synonymous with treachery, his body left hanging as carrion for the crows. Edward II, however, became legend. His death, by red-hot poker or secret escape, turned into one of the most infamous mysteries in royal history. Poets and chroniclers turned his love and suffering into myth, and in that myth he gained something he never had in life: understanding. Today Edward stands not just as a failed king, but as a symbol of forbidden love, political cruelty, and the human heart's defiance against power. His story reminds us that history often punishes emotion, yet it is emotion that keeps history alive. In the year 1193, Paris glittered with celebration. King Philip II of France, called Augustus by his admirers and the Fox of France by his rivals, was finally remarrying. His first wife, Queen Isabella of Hainaut, had died tragically young, leaving him a widower and his kingdom without a queen. For a monarch obsessed with legacy and alliances, the absence of a royal bride was both a personal wound and a political liability. Enter Princess Ingeborg of Denmark, a young woman known for her grace, intelligence, and piety. She was the sister of King Canute VI of Denmark, a powerful ruler in the north. The match was perfect on parchment. It promised peace between France and Denmark, influence over the Baltic trade routes, and a symbolic bridge between northern and western Christendom. Diplomats hailed it as a union blessed by God and guided by strategy. Ingeborg arrived in Amiens, radiant and hopeful, her golden hair covered modestly by a silk veil. Chroniclers wrote that the wedding on August 14th was magnificent, the cathedral echoing with choirs, the nobles of France dressed in jewels and crimson robes. The king, in his early 30s, was every inch the warrior monarch, tall, handsome, and commanding. To all present, it seemed like the dawn of a glorious new partnership. But by the next morning, that illusion was shattered. The king who had seemed so smitten now refused to speak to his bride. Courtiers whispered that Philip had become pale and withdrawn, that he would not even look upon Ingeborg. Before the day was done, he summoned his bishops and declared the marriage invalid, claiming he had been bewitched, that something unnatural had occurred. Ingeborg, stunned and humiliated, wept before the altar, begging her husband to remember his vows. Philip turned away. The wedding feast was cancelled, the gifts withdrawn, and the young queen was locked away in a convent, her royal title stripped before she had even worn the crown. Europe was stunned. What could have happened on their wedding night to provoke such instant revulsion? Was it witchcraft, politics, or something far more personal? The scandal had begun, and it would haunt Philip for the rest of his reign. No one knows exactly what happened between King Philip II and Queen Ingeborg on the night of their wedding, but by dawn, something had gone terribly wrong. The grand cathedral bells that had pealed in joy now rang with confusion, and servants whispered of strange events in the royal chambers. When courtiers came to greet the couple in the morning, the king's face was ashen. He refused to look at his bride, muttered orders in a trembling voice, and demanded that the bishops annul the marriage immediately. The reaction stunned everyone. The Archbishop of Reims, who had blessed their union less than 24 hours earlier, was speechless. The Danish ambassadors demanded to know what crime their princess had committed, but Philip gave no clear explanation. He claimed a grave impediment prevented the marriage, though what that impediment was, he would not say. Some said the king had discovered that Ingeborg's family was related to his own, making the marriage invalid under canon law. Others whispered of witchcraft, that Ingeborg had bewitched the king, clouding his mind and body. Whatever the cause, Philip's behaviour bordered on hysteria. Chroniclers describe him pacing, refusing food, and muttering that he was bound by evil. When priests advised him to take his wife back, he cursed them. Within days, Ingeborg was separated from the royal household and confined to a convent in Étampes. She was still legally the Queen of France, yet she was treated as a prisoner. Ingeborg's reaction was far more dignified. She wrote letters to her brother, King Canute VI of Denmark, describing her anguish and insisting the marriage had been lawful and consummated. "I am his wife before God," she declared, "and nothing but death will part us." Her words carried across Europe, stirring sympathy and outrage. The Danish court was furious. To them, the humiliation of their princess was an insult to the Danish crown. They demanded papal intervention. And so, from the very start, what might have been a private marital dispute between two people became an international scandal, one that would draw in kings, popes, and excommunications, and haunt the French throne for decades. King Philip II could not rest until his marriage to Queen Ingeborg was erased from existence. Within weeks of their disastrous wedding, he gathered a council of bishops in the city of Compiègne to declare the union void. The reasoning was laughably vague. A kinship too close for holy matrimony, the king claimed, but everyone knew it was a desperate excuse. The clergy, fearful of their monarch, agreed to dissolve the marriage, yet Ingeborg refused to accept it. From her confinement, she appealed directly to Rome. Her letter to Pope Celestine III was bold, even defiant. She accused Philip of lying before God and demanded her rightful place as queen. "I am joined to him by the law of heaven," she wrote. "No man may part what the Lord has joined." The Pope, intrigued and outraged, ordered an investigation. He ruled that the marriage was valid and commanded the king to take his wife back. But Philip ignored him completely. In a move that scandalized Europe, the king married again, this time to Agnes of Marania, a beautiful Bavarian noblewoman known for her gentleness and charm. The court adored her. The church did not. To marry while his first wife still lived and claimed him as her husband was a grave sin. The Pope excommunicated Philip, and the entire kingdom of France was placed under interdict, a terrifying punishment that suspended all church services, weddings, and burials. For 7 long months the bells of France were silent, yet Philip would not yield. He adored Agnes, calling her my true and blessed wife, while Ingeborg languished in isolation. He refused to even hear her name spoken. Chroniclers described him as obsessed, driven by something deeper than pride. Some said he was tormented by guilt. Others believed he was possessed by fear or disgust that only he understood. And still, Ingeborg endured. Locked away in convent after convent, she continued to write, to popes, bishops, and even her husband. Her words were steady, unwavering. She forgave him, she prayed for him, and she insisted that she remained his lawful queen. While Philip fought to erase her, Ingeborg fought to remind the world she existed. The scandal was no longer a secret. All of Europe was watching, and the King of France was losing the war against his own marriage. By the turn of the 13th century, King Philip II's defiance had reached the ears of a new and far more formidable pope, Innocent III. Unlike his predecessors, Innocent was no passive mediator. He was a ruler in all but name, commanding armies of priests and wielding spiritual authority with the force of an empire. When word reached him that the King of France was living openly with a second wife, while his lawful queen languished in captivity, he was enraged. Innocent's letters to Philip were sharp and uncompromising. He reminded the king that no earthly crown could outweigh divine law. "You are not above God," he wrote, "nor beyond the reach of his justice." He gave Philip a clear ultimatum: release Ingeborg, dismiss Agnes of Marania, and restore the Queen of Denmark to her rightful place, or France would suffer. The king hesitated, torn between love and power. Agnes was gentle and loyal. Ingeborg, by now, was little more than a haunting memory. But Innocent III was not bluffing. In 1200, he imposed a new interdict over all France, the second in a decade. Churches were closed, bells were silenced, marriages were forbidden, and the dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. The people panicked. Merchants cursed the king for their losses. Peasants whispered that God had turned against France. Philip's barons began to rebel. Even his allies at court grew uneasy. It was one thing to defy a pope. It was another to invite divine wrath on an entire kingdom. Finally, under crushing political and spiritual pressure, Philip relented. He dismissed Agnes, who by then had borne him 2 children, and ordered that Ingeborg be freed from her confinement. But the reunion was icy. Chroniclers say that when Ingeborg was brought before him, the king trembled and muttered that he could not bear her presence. He treated her with contempt, refusing to share her chambers or acknowledge her as queen. Yet to the world, she was restored, a victory, at least on paper. Pope Innocent was satisfied. The interdict was lifted, the churches reopened, and France returned to grace. But behind palace walls, the marriage remained a living corpse. Philip obeyed the church, but only because rebellion had become more dangerous than love. Though the papal interdict was lifted and the scandal publicly resolved, Queen Ingeborg's nightmare was far from over. She was technically restored to her title, but in truth she was more ghost than queen, existing in the margins of a court that wanted her forgotten. King Philip II refused to see her, speak to her, or even allow her to live near Paris. Instead, he sent her to a remote fortress in northern France under the guise of royal protection. Guards were instructed not to let her leave, not to let her write freely, and to treat her with the cold politeness reserved for prisoners of noble blood. Ingeborg's isolation was a political performance. To the church, she was Queen of France. To the French court, she was an embarrassing relic, the woman whose very presence reminded everyone of Philip's humiliation before Pope Innocent III. Yet even from her confinement, she refused to disappear. She continued to send carefully worded letters to Rome, each one a masterpiece of restraint and endurance. "I forgive my lord," she wrote, "for though his heart is hard, my faith is stronger than his anger." Her steadfastness turned her into a symbol across Europe. Chroniclers from Denmark to Italy wrote admiringly of her patience and piety. In an age when royal wives were discarded like pawns, Ingeborg became something extraordinary, a woman who stood against a king and survived. Meanwhile, Philip's heart remained in conflict. Though he had dismissed Agnes of Merania under papal pressure, he secretly continued to mourn her. When she died in 1201, barely 20 years old, he ordered masses in her name and wore mourning garments. Some say his hatred for Ingeborg deepened after Agnes's death, as though he blamed her for the loss of the only woman he had truly loved. Still, politics forced him to maintain appearances. He allowed Ingeborg a small household, servants and funds, but never affection. Decades passed this way. The queen grew older, but never bitter. By the time Philip began planning his later campaigns in Normandy and Flanders, Ingeborg had been trapped in her gilded exile for nearly 20 years. France had forgotten her, but Rome had not. And soon the church would once again force the king to face the woman he could not escape. By the second decade of the 13th century, King Philip II's fortunes had changed. He was no longer the reckless monarch defying popes and imprisoning queens. He was now the conqueror of Normandy, the rival of England, and the architect of a stronger France. Yet even in his triumph, one problem still shadowed his reign: Queen Ingeborg. The Pope had never forgotten her. Successive pontiffs had continued to remind Philip that his lawful wife remained unjustly confined. Letters from Rome arrived regularly, each more insistent than the last. One papal envoy even declared that Philip's victories in war would count for nothing in heaven, while the Queen of Denmark lives in sorrow. By then, Ingeborg had been a prisoner for nearly 2 decades. Perhaps time softened him, or perhaps politics made reconciliation convenient. But in 1213, Philip suddenly announced that Ingeborg would be restored to full royal honour. Chroniclers were astonished. The woman who had vanished from history was now summoned back to court, her title reinstated, her dignity restored. The church rejoiced, Denmark celebrated, and Rome declared the scandal finally over. But when Ingeborg returned to public life, the wounds were still visible. She appeared pale and fragile, her face marked by years of isolation. The courtiers bowed, yet few dared to speak to her. She was, after all, the queen who had once brought the mightiest monarch in Europe to his knees. Philip, older and hardened by politics, greeted her with formality, cold, but not cruel. He arranged for her to have a household befitting her station, though they rarely met. It was less a reunion than an armistice. Still, Ingeborg's quiet triumph was undeniable. Against all odds, she had survived imprisonment, defied annulment, and outlived her rival. Her unwavering faith had bent a king and outlasted a generation of scandals. From then on, she lived a peaceful life, residing in royal manors near Paris, attending church, and occasionally appearing beside Philip at state ceremonies. Chroniclers noted that she seemed serene, even content. Her vengeance was not loud, it was her endurance. The woman once branded as a curse on the French throne had become its moral victory. And while Philip ruled his kingdom with steel and cunning, it was Ingeborg, quiet, patient, and unbroken, who ruled history's judgment. As the years passed, King Philip II of France became the very image of royal success. He had defeated the English at Bouvines, expanded his realm, and transformed France into the most powerful kingdom in Western Europe. But behind his triumphs, there remained one wound that no crown could hide: the scandal of Queen Ingeborg. To his subjects, it seemed the affair had been resolved. Ingeborg lived quietly in royal estates, attended church with grace, and kept away from court intrigue. Yet the truth was more complicated. Philip's conscience was restless. He never spoke of her, but his actions betrayed guilt. He gave generous gifts to monasteries, funded masses for the souls of the dead, and surrounded himself with confessors who preached repentance. One chronicler remarked that the king, though mighty in war, trembled at the judgment of heaven. Some said Philip feared divine punishment for what he had done to Ingeborg. Others believed the memory of Agnes of Marania, his lost love, haunted him even more. Perhaps both women occupied his heart in different ways, one as sin, the other as sorrow. But either way, he began to withdraw from the pleasures of his youth. His nights grew quieter, his temper shorter. The once brilliant and fiery monarch seemed hollowed out by his own history. Meanwhile, Ingeborg's reputation only grew brighter. To the people, she became a symbol of holiness, the queen who forgave when she had every right to hate. Even the church began to revere her as a model of Christian endurance. Priests invoked her name in sermons about patience and faith. She had become, in a strange way, the moral mirror of the king himself. Philip's final years were marked by victories and regret. He built churches, endowed hospitals, and tried to make peace with Rome once and for all. When he died in 1223, the clergy praised him as Augustus the Great, but whispers persisted that he had died seeking forgiveness from the woman he had wronged. Queen Ingeborg did not attend his funeral, yet she prayed for his soul. For all the cruelty he had shown her, she remained constant in grace. History would remember him as a conqueror, but her as the woman who conquered his conscience. When King Philip II died in 1223, France mourned a monarch who had shaped its destiny, but the woman he had wronged most lived on. Queen Ingeborg, now in her 50s, had outlasted her husband, her rivals, and nearly every bishop who had once conspired against her. For the first time in 30 years, she was truly free. No longer shadowed by guards or confined by royal will, she withdrew to a quiet residence near Corbeil, not far from Paris. Though she held the title of Dowager Queen, she lived simply, spending her days in prayer, charity, and correspondence. The courtiers who visited her spoke of her calm dignity, the same serenity that had carried her through decades of isolation. Some said her eyes still held sadness, but not bitterness. She had learned to turn suffering into peace. Her stepson, King Louis VIII, treated her with genuine respect. Unlike his father, he acknowledged her publicly as Queen of France and ensured her lands and income were restored. Under his brief reign, and later under her stepson, Louis IX, the future Saint Louis, Ingeborg finally enjoyed the honour she had been denied for so long. The court that once called her cursed now spoke of her as blessed. She devoted her fortune to good works, founding churches, endowing monasteries, and aiding the poor. Those who met her described her as gentle yet formidable, a woman who had survived scandal, exile, and humiliation without losing her faith. Even the chroniclers who once pitied her now praised her. No queen of France, one wrote, ever bore injustice with such patience or triumphed with such silence. Though Ingeborg rarely spoke of her past, she never renounced the vows she had made as a young bride. She considered herself Philip's true wife until death, and in her prayers she asked God to forgive him, not for her sake, but for the peace of his soul. By the time she passed away in 1237, She had lived almost half a century after that infamous wedding day. France had changed beyond recognition, yet her story still lingered, not as gossip now, but as legend. The woman whom a king had tried to erase became one of the most enduring figures of medieval endurance. The queen who outlasted cruelty, conquered shame, and in the end triumphed through faith. Centuries later, the strange marriage of King Philip II and Queen Ingeborg still echoes through history, part royal tragedy, part moral fable. What began as a diplomatic union meant to secure peace between France and Denmark became one of the most infamous scandals in medieval Europe. Chroniclers debated for generations what truly happened between them. What could have driven one of the most calculating monarchs of his age to reject his bride within a single day? Some said it was political, that Philip regretted binding himself to Denmark once the alliance lost its value. Others insisted it was personal, that he had been repulsed by Ingeborg's appearance, or that he was bewitched by another woman even before the wedding. But the most enduring theory was spiritual, that guilt, pride, and superstition had clouded the king's mind, convincing him that his marriage was cursed. Whatever the truth, it revealed a darker side of medieval kingship, where private desire could overturn divine law and shake the authority of popes. The Church never forgot the affair. Pope Innocent III's relentless defence of Ingeborg became a defining moment for papal power, proving that even the mightiest monarchs could be humbled by Rome. Historians later called it a quiet revolution in obedience, the day when kings learned they were not gods. For Denmark, Ingeborg became a national heroine. Her letters, preserved in archives, were studied as examples of piety and moral strength. For France, however, she remained an uncomfortable memory, the queen who refused to vanish. Even today, her name appears in chronicles alongside Joan of Arc and Blanche of Castile as one of the few medieval women who faced absolute power and survived with dignity. As for Philip, his legacy remains divided. To some, he is still Philip Augustus, the architect of modern France. To others, he is the tyrant who tried to discard a woman like a political inconvenience and was forced to repent by history itself. Ingeborg's story endures because it is more than a royal scandal. It is a parable about endurance, faith, and justice. In a world ruled by kings, she reminded Christendom that even the crown bowed before conscience. And though centuries have passed, her quiet defiance still whispers through time. Truth, no matter how small, outlives the mighty who try to silence it.